Hello and welcome back. In our last meeting, we discussed the role that ideologies play within the modern political sphere. We're now going to move to the modernization of economic life as we examine the Industrial Revolution and its impact on societies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, starting with the birth of the factory and the advent of the machine age, which signals a radical shift from agriculture to industry. Let's begin by describing industrialization in its historical context. It commences with the development of the factory system starting in the mid-1700s and is marked by a transformation from an agricultural economy based on human or animal labor into an economy based on the mass production of goods in mechanized factories, often using primitive assembly line techniques. From a geographical perspective, industrialization began in Britain. But why? What conditions might help us explain why Britain gave birth to modern industrialization? To answer this question, let's start with the political stability that the English achieved by the end of the 17th century with their parliamentary monarchy. There were also economic innovations that appeared at this time, such as the establishment of the Bank of England, one of the first national banks, which had the capacity for the large-scale lending that was necessary for industrialization. There were abundant local concentrations of key resources as well, particularly coal and iron ore, which are the building blocks of a modern industrial economy. There was also the moderate British climate, never terribly hot, nor terribly cold. This was important for a transportation infrastructure that initially depended on the construction and maintenance of canals, which seldom froze. The British also enjoyed extensive trade relations with Asia, India, and America that generated significant wealth, which became the financial basis for the investments that were needed for industrialization. Capital accumulation is the key to the ability to industrialize, because building factories is very, very expensive. But once completed, the factories bestow numerous advantages. First, in Britain, they allowed the concentration of materials and labor under one roof, reducing transportation costs and increasing worker productivity. Second, the use of machines enabled the standardization of products, thereby improving quality and consistency. Third, the machines eliminated the need for specialized workers, thereby cutting down training time and expanding the labor market to include workers who might otherwise be considered marginal. Finally, factories cut down production time, ensuring reliable deliveries to far-flung markets. Mechanization brought considerable wealth to those who had the capital to invest in building and operating factories. The owners used their newly won riches to influence politics and legislation, challenging the more traditional titled and landed gentry for power and influence. But all was not well on the factory floor. Workers endured harsh conditions in the plants, which were constructed with little concern for employee safety. They were subjected to squalid, often dehumanizing working conditions. The factories were dirty, hot, unventilated, with workdays stretching from 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. Living conditions in crowded and overpriced housing were scarcely better, as workers were exposed to both water and air pollution in their homes. Outbreaks of disease, including tuberculosis and cholera, were frequent and could quickly sicken the population. All of these elements contributed to a very bleak existence for factory workers. In the early mid to 19th century, the average life expectancy of an industrial worker in the manufacturing city of Manchester was less than 25 years, about half of that of a rural villager. Industrialization thus gave rise to two separate and very unequal classes. While the bourgeoisie enjoyed all the comforts their wealth could afford, factory workers suffered appallingly. This social dichotomy led many intellectuals of the era to ask whether industrialization was a benefit or a plague. Should the gains of mechanization be considered progress if they lead to such physical misery and even death? This was the issue that spawned the two main ideologies that emerged in the 19th century, capitalism and socialism. The central spokesmen for these conflicting ideologies were Adam Smith, the godfather of economic liberalism, or capitalism as we know it today, and Karl Marx, the main ideologue of revolutionary socialism. In 1776, Smith, a Scottish economist, wrote The Wealth of Nations, which analyzed the economic processes involved in production and exchange, and, in doing so, effectively created a handbook for aspiring capitalists. Among its tenets was the maxim that the value of a good can be equated to the effort, or work, needed to produce that good, now known as the labor theory of value. This contrasted with the traditional notion that value stemmed from either ownership of land or from some precious metal such as gold or silver. According to Smith, the fruits of labor, the wealth itself, can be distributed in a variety of ways, but it's the labor that creates the wealth. Another principle which Smith posited was the division of labor, whereby work can be split into short, simplified sub-processes, resulting in enhanced factory productivity and increased profits. A third concept that Smith advocated was free trade, the notion that exchange between states should be as unrestricted as possible, as opposed to protectionism, where tariffs are used to shelter domestic industries from cheaper, or better, products imported from other countries. A fourth principle proposed by Smith was laissez-faire, a French term which can be roughly translated as leave it alone. It's essentially a market policy of non-intervention that minimizes the role of the state in the economy. The doctrine of laissez-faire leads to the last principle of Smith's economic liberalism, which he called the invisible hand, a metaphor for the self-regulating forces of supply and demand, which produce the socially desirable effect of better goods at a cheaper price without anyone consciously engineering this result. Of course, Smith's economic theories were but one facet of the ideology of liberalism that emerged during the 18th and 19th centuries. As you'll recall from our discussion of John Locke and the Atlantic Revolutions, liberalism was also a political doctrine based on the natural rights of humanity, in particular, freedom. It was a legal credo as well, insisting that all free people should be equal before the law. And finally, liberalism was also a social philosophy that prized individual autonomy and self-reliance over dependence on the state or on the government. Yet, this liberal optimism, the belief that everyone had an equal chance at success if they worked hard, was largely a fiction. The actual conditions of the workers in early industrial society were closer to slavery. The significant discrepancy, the growing social and economic inequality of industrialized society, came to be known as the social question and gave rise to increasing intellectual criticism of the factory system and liberal economic ideals. These ideological challenges, typically grouped together under the rubric of socialism, offered another view of industrial society, an alternative to liberalism. If liberals talked about equality of opportunity as the belief that everyone is on the same footing at the starting line, socialists talked about equality of outcome, the belief that everyone should derive the same benefits at the finish line. Where liberals valued individual achievement, socialists prized collective effort. When liberals spoke of legal equality, socialists emphasized social and economic equality. And finally, if liberals favored unregulated commerce and laissez-faire capitalism, socialists stressed the role of the state in policing markets and in intervening to correct economic inequalities. So, liberalism and socialism developed into very different and often contradictory approaches that, ironically, emerged from the same Enlightenment idea, the concept of equality. Of the 19th century socialist thinkers, Karl Marx was by far the most significant. He provided his most influential analysis of capitalist society in a pamphlet called The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. Here's Marx's argument, greatly condensed. First, all societies are characterized by class struggle, by the conflict between those who own the means of production and those who don't. It's a conflict, in other words, between the economic interest of a dominant class and those of an oppressed class. In Marx's terms, it's the bourgeoisie, or factory owners, versus the proletariat, or factory workers. Second, according to Marx, the conflict between the classes is going to lead inevitably to an apocalyptic social revolution, since only the total annihilation of capitalism can create a just and equitable society. And finally, this society would be organized according to Marx's famous slogan, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Of course, it never happened. At least it never happened quite the way that Marx predicted it. He thought that Britain would be the first society to experience this revolution, since the class discrepancies were at their most extreme there. He was wrong. Yet, in the second half of the 19th century, socialist ideals began to take hold across Europe, leading to the creation of industrial worker unions such as the International Working Men's Association, which, although not directly advocating revolution, utilized strategies such as collective bargaining and work stoppages to convince factory owners to increase pay and improve working conditions. Unions expanded their influence into politics with the creation of socialist political parties, often called social democratic parties, that aspired to transform bourgeois economic and social practices from within by promoting legislation that would improve working and living conditions. To give Marx his due, socialist revolutions did occur in the 20th century, first in Russia and then in China, but more on that in a later lecture. Let's wrap up. Let's consider a major consequence of the industrialization that we've outlined. As you'll learn from your readings this week, what starts as factory mechanization in British cities such as Manchester and Birmingham ends up as a global division between those societies that produce raw materials and those that process and manufacture them into finished goods. One's rural, and the other's urban. Very often, the same two, rural and urban, agriculture and manufacturing, can coexist within a given country. But as the end of the 19th century approaches, we begin to see a world divided along these lines, which will produce very uneven economic development with many unpleasant consequences for the 20th century. Broadly speaking, this schism will portend the development of separate economies, those in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia that are based upon the export of raw materials, and those economies that are founded on manufacturing that flourish in Western Europe and North America. In effect, this schism created the conditions for a new kind of imperialism, one that will be our subject when we next meet. Until then, best wishes.